I want to ask you five pieces of music that inspired you, set you off on your musical path, or has been part of your musical journey over the years?
Yeah, well, of course, being a musician, I could name 1,000 pieces that matter to me, but I can point to some little mild, markers on the highway of life that were significant to me.
Then go for it.
And so for me to begin with, as a little kid, my brother is 8 years older than I, and he brought home records in the '60s when I was, just a little kid. And so I was listening to records that are legendary now at the time they came out, being, and of course, number one amongst those was the Beatles. So I always would name a Beatles track as being super important to me because I used to go to sleep listening to both with the Beatles, the second Beatles album, and then later on Revolver. Those two albums are really important to me. So I'll name Taxman off Revolver because that, as soon as that track starts with that little bits of sort of studio sort of dialogue, there's a bit of chatter and sort of noise of a tape machine going on and an engineer talking or something, and they have that count in to Taxman, immediately takes me back to, my childhood. And also I think it's a fantastic song anyway. What a great way to start a record. So Taxman from Revolver by the Beatles is number one for me.
Yep.
Number two, I'll go with something I discovered later in life when I was about 21, which was to go back and listen to the old Elvis Sun Sessions record, which were compiled together onto one album eventually in the late '70s. And I discovered my love of Elvis then, because Elvis was someone that was always around when I was growing up, but he was kind of a little bit corny to me, and I was more into the sort of the new bands like the Beatles and the Stones and whatever, and Elvis was kind of like a yesterday's act, and he had a bit of a cabaret vibe as well, to my mind. But of course, I completely, retract all of that because I love Elvis in every manifestation of the man's career at this point, and I worship the corniness of those bad soundtrack albums he did as much as I love the genuine rock and roll and brilliance of his early recordings. And I think Elvis was absolutely a fantastic performer in every respect, and I like his movies too. I have a whole collection of them, so that's how much of an Elvis fan I am these days. But it took me a while to get there, and the record that did it was actually the Sun Sessions. So I'll choose "That's All Right, Mama," which is the opening track on that album, and also the track that basically brought Elvis to fame and eventually to the attention of RCA, who signed him up after Sam Phillips produced him and down at Tennessee there.
Yep.
In Memphis. There's a number three, very important album for me growing up, was my teenage years, was the Blitzkrieg, was the Ramones' first album. I was a punk rocker, and the Ramones basically are one of the most important bands in history, in my opinion. They changed everything. I mean, I know they weren't reinventing the wheels melodically, but just sonically, their approach to music and their cutting it down to its bare basics, just like pure rock and roll, was something we needed to hear. And that first Ramones album was a revelation. It's still one of my favorite records. And so I'll choose the opening track, which is insane. Blitzkrieg Bop. I mean, it's just iconic. Then after that, I'll go for another punk rock record, but from the '60s era of punk, which a lot of people don't, if they're only casual listeners, wouldn't be aware that punk music is traced back through a long sort of pedigree, and there was a genre called '60s punk or garage music. All these garage bands from the '60s, and one of the great ones was the Standells. So let's choose Ride on Sunset Strip, a movie I still haven't seen and really want to see, but it's from the soundtrack of that album, and brilliant song. It was all about basically a bunch of teenagers that were getting sort of causing a fuss by being gathering in Sunset Boulevard outside restaurants and bars and record shops back in the late '60s, and it caused the Hollywood police to kind of have a big crackdown and arrest a whole bunch of people because the businesses were complaining about them, interfering with their customers or whatever. So it was really stupid. It was very mild riot, but the song is fantastic. It's a great song. And last but not least, once I get on the rock and roll tip, I'm going to go with the New York Dolls, because that's after punk rock, I sort of retraced my steps to them as well, because they were part of that whole continuing pedigree of punk rock in their own way. They were glam. They were, they're progenitors of what we now call hair metal in the way they looked, with all their teased up and sprayed hair and outrageous clothing. But musically, they were like, they loved the Stones and they loved Bo Diddley, and they were just classic rock and roll, and still, I think, one of the greatest rock and roll bands of all time. So let's choose their opening, Personality Crisis, from their first album, New York Dolls. They're my five iconic songs.
And they are iconic too. I was listening, and of course, most of those are from my youth too. But Dave Faulkner from the Hoodoo Gurus, thank you so much for sharing all those things and the passion that goes with those tracks that you've chosen. And we look forward to seeing you and the Gurus on stage at Bluesfest in just a few weeks' time.
Brilliant. Can't wait.